Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to the Sage Intacct webinar today. Thank you for joining us for Not Your Mother's Chart of Accounts, a modern-day approach to finance and accounting in the cloud. My name is Ben Kang, and I'm joined today by Linda Pinion, our Solution Specialist. Also, we welcome all questions and comments during the webinar today. We've set aside some time at the end of the presentation to discuss anything that's on your mind. We'll try to address all the questions during the call today, but if for some reason we cannot get to your question in the time allotted, we will follow up after the webinar, and we will also be distributing a copy of the recording after the event. So I'd like to give a brief overview of the company and the product for those of you who may not be very familiar with us yet. I'll talk a little bit about the challenges around building and maintaining the chart of accounts, along with the better way forward that Sage Intacct proposes. And then we'll get to the really exciting part of this webinar, where Linda will show you the product in action. And we'll answer questions so you can really see how Sage Intacct flips the traditional idea of how the chart of accounts need to be built and maintained, and the benefits that come with that. So who are we? Well, we're a company whose customers are companies and organizations that have successfully scaled their operations. And these are companies that support over 3,500 users, that manage over 660 entities, that do about 30 million monthly web services calls. They've booked over 100 million total transactions, manage over 12 million in-flight revenue recognition schedules, and run over 1.5 million transactions a month. And in addition to ensuring our customers have the functionality to grow their business, we have focused on building a scalable foundation that can support ambitious growth. And Sage Intacct is ready to support success at any scale for any of our growing customers. We have a very complete system that allows you to put finance at the center of what you do and work with best-in-class partnerships for all the key functions across your organization. We have all the features of a multi-currency, multi-entity financial system that streamlines your processes and gives you visibility across your business, all delivered through the cloud so that you can take advantage of all the rapid innovation and everyone being on the same version at the same time. We're also dedicated to a best-in-class approach to focus on finance and have partnerships in various areas with seamless integration across all of our key partners. And as for our customer base, it's a wide range of folks, public and private, who are growing and using Sage Intacct, and they're similar to you. And the reason why our ecosystem continues to flourish is that we're extremely focused on customer satisfaction. But don't just take our word for it. Hear from the folks who keep track of these kinds of things, these kinds of awards, ratings, and rankings. So that's an overview of who we are. Now let's talk about the chart of accounts. At Sage Intacct, when it comes to the chart of accounts, we look differently at this, and we know it can get very complicated. You've got to account for all the things on the left that you see here. If you have multiple locations, multiple projects, multiple vendors, there are a lot of different dimensions at which you want to be able to look at how your business is performing. And then on the right side, there's many audiences that you need to report performance to. And we know it's oftentimes a challenge to track your business the way you want. So when it comes to reporting, the process takes too long since you're not able to measure performance of things like changing strategies or slicing and dicing information in real time. Your management, your board, your project managers, a lot of different things that you need to capture, and a lot of different audiences who may not always be interested in the same view and the same amount of detail. With Sage Intacct, you'll have a very simplified chart of accounts. You tag dimensions the way you want to run your business, the things that you measure, the lens by which you look at your business, as well as the reports that you want to produce. Dimensions, in case you're not familiar with them, you can think of them as a classification system that helps you organize your company information in meaningful ways, such as by location, or by product, or by customer. And with dimensions, you'll be able to look at everything across your chart of accounts through the lens that matters to you. And dimensions are important for a few reasons. One is that with Sage Intacct, our chart of accounts is modern and only requires a natural account, which is easier to maintain versus an account number that's longer and highly segmented to track for additional things like department, location, or project. Secondly, a modern chart of accounts enables you to do your reporting. Your data, when captured, will be dimensional at the source, which means your reports will also be presented dimensionally. For example, instead of a report that shows all locations all the time, imagine a report that shows a subset of locations that you designate based on your needs. So how does this work? Well, traditionally, a chart of accounts might look something like this. You have to segment the account by the aspect that you want to keep track of. In this example, here's the segmentation by location, department, and project. And this adds up to 75 different account code combinations that you've got to enter and track against. And imagine having to manage a chart like this when your business is growing and you have to insert new entities, new locations, new departments, new projects. The combinations will increase significantly, and this kind of maintenance can explode very quickly and be difficult to maintain. But with Sage Intacct, we take all that stuff and we simplify it for you. As I mentioned earlier, with Sage Intacct, you only need a natural account, and you can tag dimensions to cover the different aspects you're tracking and want to report against. And so how this plays out, with Sage Intacct, you get a standard set of dimensions out of the box that are configurable, and these are the ones that we see companies use most often. You can also add user-defined dimensions, which you can think of as your own set of dimensions that are unique to your business and unique to what you need to be tracking and reporting against. For example, think of a restaurant chain that uses 6 dimensions to track their business in detail. They renamed the location dimension to franchise and the class dimension to meal type because that is how they track their business. And then they also add another dimension called source to track the different types of sources of revenue. And since dimensions are fully integrated into Sage Intacct's reporting and dashboards, slicing and dicing your financial and operational data by dimension is automatic and easy to use. And at the end of the day, you put these dimensions onto your chart of accounts, and what you get in the system is powerful. You can look at your business based on the metrics that matter to you, for example, by using a dashboard. And this means you're automating the information that needs to be produced since it lives in your system, your one system, instead of categorizing things or doing other stuff that's manually time-consuming and error-prone. And as a result, you'll have much better visibility that can be shared to all the key stakeholders in your organization. DataZoo. This company provides a dynamic platform through which marketers can purchase advertising and execute marketing campaigns. DataZoo's primary growth driver was acquisitions to expand their reach into new markets. Now, early in their history, they acquired several new entities in Europe as well as in Asia. The acquisitions helped the company grow, but it also introduced multiple charts of accounts into the accounting organization, since these acquired companies were using accounting systems that weren't the same as what the parent company was using. Now, the impact of all these acquisitions created a much slower close process, as they had to manually consolidate financial results across these multiple locations and multiple charts of accounts. And the net result was that it took almost 3 weeks in order to get any visibility into how the company was performing. And for a company that's operating in the technology-fueled and fast-paced industry of digital advertising, that timing just wasn't going to work out. But by switching to Sage Intacct, a solution that had multi-entity capabilities that are native to the architecture, they were able to standardize their chart of accounts across all their locations and entities and automate the entire consolidation process and drop their close process down to just 8 days. And what it did for them was to more continuously find ways of improving their workflows and focus on the future of the company versus looking backwards. And also by using dimensions along with their standard chart of accounts, they were able to quickly get visibility into revenues by campaigns that they run for individual customers, profitability, and as well as get a more accurate read on true profitability by country operations. Now, this was challenging for them in the past because expenses that were incurred in a single country were actually serving campaigns whose revenues were being generated in another country. A modern chart of accounts should also be able to handle complex legal structures, as is done for Trine Partners, a multi-billion-dollar asset management firm. Now, this customer manages a portfolio of investments using over 50 entities that need to be analyzed both individually and in aggregate. And also, these investments have different ownership percentages that need to be factored into the reporting and consolidations. They standardize their chart of accounts across all their entities using 9 dimensions. Their controller benefited from multi-entity reporting and instant analytics to become a more data-driven company. Now, one final point before we start the demonstration. Unlike custom fields, which are usually transaction type specific, dimensions apply to all transactions and budgets. Multi-dimensional reporting gives you a level of ease of use that you can't get with custom fields, primarily because dimensions can be added by finance without getting IT involved. And as I mentioned before, dimensions are integrated into the reporting UI, so it's easy for you to create reports that break down performance by business driver with the precise format that you need. And that brings us to the demonstration portion of this webinar, which I will ask Linda to perform. Linda?
Thank you, Ben, for giving us such a great introduction to dimensions and the chart of accounts in Intact. As Ben mentioned, my name is Linda Pinion, and I am a sales engineer here at Intact, and happy to be with you today to bring you this asset around how Intact is going to help you have a modern chart of accounts and how that's going to impact the delivery of your reporting. So today we're going to start out with looking at a role as the controller, and I want to share with you the end result first. So what we're going to take a look at is dimensions in action and let you see how dimensions and having this modern chart is going to allow you to have those granular type of reports and be able to filter on what I call dimensionalized data. For those of you who have not seen Intact before, this solution is a cloud-based solution. So anywhere, anytime you have access to the internet and the proper permissions, you have access to your information. Permissions is key to this conversation because today I am a super user. I'm logged in as the controller, and I've landed on my dashboard. So if you think about dashboards, this is really your window into how your business is performing and tracking. And for me, as the controller, there is some specific information that I want to look at on a frequent basis. Now, I should tell you that as the controller, I have permission to all the different applications, as well as I have permission to transact in all 4 companies that I'm managing in this one instance of Intact. So if we look here, you'll see that these are my 4 companies: Texas, Maine, California, and Florida. Now, why is that important? Because as I look at this dashboard, I'm looking at a consolidated view. So I'm looking across the entire enterprise of my companies in this consolidated dashboard that I have created. And by the way, you can create as many dashboards as you choose to. Dashboards are designed for you, the business user, to create and maintain. Now, knowing that I have 4 companies, I may not want to look at a consolidated view. I may want to focus just on one of those companies. And to do that, I'm going to take advantage of one of the dimensions in Intact, which is location. And I'm going to apply a dashboard filter so that I can look at just the Texas company in this dashboard view. So what's happened is, because I have dimensionalized data, because I have the ability to filter on those dimensions, I'm now seeing a view of the controller dashboard, and it's been filtered to only show me the Texas entity. So remember, I have 4 companies. I've now taken that data, I've filtered it by that dimension called location, and I'm now looking at just Texas. So all of these boxes at the top here are what we call performance cards. So this is the value of revenue that has been generated from our Texas company. If we come back up here to the filters, you might notice that there are some other filters that I can use. And as we go along, I'll refer to these and we'll go back and look at all of the dimensions, which could in essence be filters for these dashboards. So one other one that I have populated here is a customer dimension. And that means that I could take, excuse me, I could take this dashboard and I could filter it by more than one of these dimensions. So I could use a combination of Texas and a customer if I chose to. I also have the ability to filter by date. So I could take this dashboard and I could backdate this to the end of May, apply this filter, and the combination of the date and the company or location here would represent the dashboard to me. So let's come back. Let's set it to our current date, which is July the 18th, and let's set it back to all locations and apply those filters. And now we're back to exactly the dashboard that we started out with. So talking about the dashboard, this is the view that's going to allow you to see how your company or your business is performing. It's a lot like that dashboard in your car in that it's going to give you some visual indicators of what's going on. The performance cards here at the top, you'll notice there are some visual indicators here, and you'll notice that some of these are being compared to previous months or previous periods. In addition to that, each one of these has the ability to drill into. So if you take a look at the G&A expenses, I'm comparing this to a previous month. So now I have that quick business insight. I can look and see how I am tracking against a previous month or previous period. In addition to that, as I look through here and I'm doing some comparisons, it's relatively early in the month, but I'm seeing some larger numbers down here in my variances, which is coming in from my purchasing. But I'm also seeing a transaction here for some office expense, which is our rent. And if we take a look at this particular report, it's a general ledger report. So it's anytime I drill into this data, it's going to take me right to the GL. And you'll see that this is an invoice from accounts payable that's come in from Midtown Property. And it's an invoice that I've entered one time. However, it's an invoice that has been distributed across my different companies. So let's take a look at how that plays through, and we'll also take a look at how the dimensions play a part in how we key this transaction. So again, an invoice, an AP invoice from Midtown Property for $5,900. We can see that it's due in 13 days and I have not made any payments on it. As I scroll down, what you'll notice is that I have expensed this and I've split that $5,900 out and tagged it to each individual location. So the key word there is I've tagged it to a transaction. Remember, location is one of the dimensions that's predefined for you in Intact. So when you think about a transaction, you're going to tag it to one or more of the 10 dimensions that have been predefined in Intact. Now, this is one invoice. I have manually split it. However, just to give you a little extra benefit here, I'm running what's called an multi-entity environment, which means I have multiple companies. And I also have the option through my general ledger to set up allocation rules. So I have set up the ability to allocate by location. And when I point to that rule for this 1750, Intact's going to do the math for me. It's going to take that 1750 and it's going to split it evenly across my companies and departments. This is a perfect example for us to stop for a moment and talk about how these dimensions work in the different subsystems, in the different applications. So starting with location, all the way over to user-defined dimension, each one of these columns is a dimension. Now, there are 7 predefined dimensions with our core application. In addition to that, there are 3 additional dimensions that are optional based on your subscription. If you subscribe to projects, then you'll have the project dimension, which you see here on my transaction line. If you subscribe to inventory, you will have the warehouse dimension, another one that you see on my transaction line. If you subscribe to contract management, you will have the contract dimension, which you don't see on my transaction line because I am not subscribed to that application. What you do see at the very end is the user-defined dimension, and remember that you can define unlimited dimensions yourself. So really, in essence, it's unlimited dimensions. However, depending on your subscription, you're either going to have 7 to 10 that will be predefined for you. I like to think of dimensions as a way to tell the story. So when I look at a transaction, I can look at the dimensions that were tagged to that transaction, and it tells me more about the background of where the transaction came from and why I'm keying this transaction. So that's why when you look at a transaction and you see the ability to tag it to these other dimensions, it becomes a way for you to tell the story and then eventually to be able to filter on that data, because what we are creating here is that dimensionalized data. That's what's going to allow us to slice and dice. Now, you may notice too that up here, this is the area where I can populate on that AP invoice to those different dimensions. And when I use these drop downs, you're going to see that I have valid projects. I have, valid items. So this is how I'm going to choose what dimensions I want to use to populate, to create the tags on this transaction. So this is, again, a way for you to be able to see how those transactions are coded and also how they are tagged to those specific dimensions. And remember, we're coming right back to the dashboard and right back to that drill down into G&A expenses, which allows us to see where those transactions are and to drive right to that source document. Now, just a couple of more things about the top part of the dashboard here. Obviously, these are the areas of the business that are important to our controller. A lot of times reports like this sales by square foot report is not important but only to certain individuals. This is also one of our performance cards, just like G&A. But here, what we've done is we've combined financial information with operational data. So just another way for you to have access to different types of reports, whether they're straight financial or combining statistical information. In this case, the statistical information is coming from square foot. Square foot is represented by the square feet in all of the warehouses. So this is an environment where we have companies who each have their own individual warehouses, and that warehouse, if you recall, is another one of the dimensions. So now we have the ability to create reports by warehouse. We're using square feet as a statistical account and then creating a statistical journal entry. That's what this $156,100 is. It represents the total square feet in all the warehouses. And then we've combined that and done the math to come up with a report of sales per square foot in a monthly bucketed report, along with another one of our visuals, which is a spark line, to give you that trending, if you will, that visual indicator of how sales are tracking per square foot. So coming back to the dashboard, one of the other reports that I will share with you is this income statement report. And this is another one that really demonstrates how those dimensions will impact your reporting. So think again about the fact that we have 4 companies here. This is a report that was created with our financial report writer. And each company is in its own column. You might notice some shading there. That's called conditional shading. And that is also denoted by a rule that I've set up that says if anything is equal to 0, I would like for you to flag that or visually put that red on it so that I know that I need to go and do some research. Again, let's take a look at the drill down. This is going to give you, instead of the expense side of the house, this is going to go to the revenue side of the house. So now we're looking at sales. And, you know, my sales have been broken out by product category. So I'm going to take a look at surveillance sales in the Texas company. And when we drill into this, again, we drill right into the general ledger report. Now, one of the things that you may ask is, well, gosh, do I have to look at all of that data? Can I narrow my search down? You absolutely can. So here, this is again where those dimensions come into play. As I look at a standard report in Intact, and this is a great example of one of the reports that Intact has already created for you. This is a general ledger report. You're going to have the ability to either broaden or narrow the amount of information that you see on this report. So here you can give it certain period information or a starting and ending date. If I scroll down, you'll notice that there are some other options that I have about, you know, printing activity, printing accounts that only has activity versus printing everything even if there's 0 activity. There's also the ability to access the dimensions. Now, we haven't talked about dimension report structure. We will in just a moment because that's like the next step to a dimension. But you'll notice here is department and here is location. So again, you can choose how you want this report to come up based on a date range, based on a reporting period, based on a department or a dimension. So coming back to that report, when we look at it, we see there's several pieces of information here. You'll notice that I am showing the department, which again, remember, is one of those 7 dimensions. And I also have the ability now to look at individual transactions. So let's take a look at this transaction here from the Texas Alarm Company. You can see that it's past due. You can see that they have made a partial payment. We can drill into that partial payment if we choose to. If we scroll down, we can see where this was posted, and we start to see a few of the dimensional pieces of information. So here's department, here's location, and here's class. And if we drill to the source document, which in this case is the sales invoice, what we're going to see here is all of the detail about the transaction. So now what we see is the item ID. So this item is a dimension. The warehouse, another dimension. Location, department. And then employee and class are 2 more of the dimensions. This particular transaction was not tagged to an employee. It could have been. It was certainly tagged to a class. And then remember that customer is another one of those dimensions, as is project. So we could have tagged this to a specific project. So again, this is how you tell the story of the transaction by tagging it to these dimensions. Coming back to our income statement. So again, remember that this drill down is available anytime I have that hyperlink. And now you've seen both the expense side and you've seen the revenue side utilizing those dimensions. So let's go take a look at the dimensions that are available to you, and those are housed in our reports area. So if we just take a look at this screen here, this is part of the setup, and as you define and begin your implementation with Intact, you're probably going to want to sit down with your project team and look at how you want to see the dimensions being used. And what will help you with that is to look at the different reports that you're generating. And for most people, there are some standard reports that you always want, and you want them in a certain format. You want by customer, by department, by location. And because the reports are the end result, start there, and then that will help you to define how you set those dimensions up. Here they are, starting with class, all the way down to warehouse. You'll notice that I have projects turned on, so I have subscribed to that. I do not have contracts. So contracts are not one of the dimensions that I have activated here. You'll also notice that there are dimension structures and dimension groups. And this is for you to set up more advanced type filtering for your reporting. As an example, one of the things that I have done is I've set up some specific reporting around purchasing, and I've set up a reporting structure for just my indirect suppliers, and that has allowed me to set up this group, link my vendors to that group, and then when I'm doing a report, it's for those indirect suppliers. So it's a grouping of vendors that are in a subgroup called indirect suppliers. So again, just understanding all of the things that you want to do with your reporting will help you determine how you set up your dimensions. So let's come back to our controller dashboard for a moment. Let's take this income statement and let's utilize the dimensions a little bit differently. So here's this report that we looked at earlier. Remember that we drilled in so we could see the drill down. But let's take this same report and let's look at the filters that we can use on this report. So again, remembering that we have dimensions that we can use to filter by. These are the ones that are active, that I've turned on, and I'm allowing you to change every time you execute this report. I'm allowing you to change how it filters the data. So let's just say that I want to filter this down to just the Texas location and a specific item. And we'll just choose the 8-channel surveillance system. And once I choose those dimensions, and notice that I can choose one or more, so I can have a combination. Once I choose those and execute the report, now you're going to see the same income statement, a little different format, in that now you see Texas as a company, and you see 2 locations, Austin and Dallas, independently shown here, but also being rolled up or consolidated into Texas. So there's a hierarchy. When you look at the location listing, you see Texas as a company, but you also see the ability to have multiple locations. In fact, unlimited locations. So I could have unlimited locations rolling up to Texas. And I could also group these locations together. So I can have location groups. I can also have department groups. For reporting purposes, that may be something that you want to consider. The same type of functionality that you saw before, the conditional shading, the drill down, all of that works the same way when I slice and dice or filter this report. If we come back to the income statement and we take a look here at how I've broken out my sales. Remember I said that I broke my sales out by product category. So if you look here, you see just general sales, kind of the over, the kind of the black hole, if you will, of sales. So if it doesn't fall into one of these product categories, it goes into sales or sales other. Alarm accessories, surveillance, and security cameras. Those are all product lines or product categories to me. So when I look at this, I might look at it and say, well, that's great. I know what my sales are by product category, but I'd really like to know underneath surveillance, what are we selling and who, meaning which company is selling. So I can do that change right here from the dashboard, provided I have permissions. I can access the report on the fly. So now it's dropped me into the financial report writer. And to change the view of this, I'm going to change the level of detail on the sales account. And I show you this because I'm going to use the dimensions to expand this data. So I clicked on expansion, and as I open up this drop down, I have the choice of what do I want to use dimensionally to filter and change the view of the data. So I'm going to choose items, and as I choose that, I can then come up and preview this report. And now you're going to see a different report, because instead of having my sales broken out by product category, I have sales and I'm showing the individual items that I'm selling. So now I have the detail spread across my 4 companies, so I still see who's selling what items, and I have that rule turned on to show me the conditional shading. Now, if you remember when I went into this, I had the option of choosing any of these dimensions. So maybe you don't want to see it by item, you want to see it by customer. Maybe you want to see it by department. The great news about this is that I can do the same type of pivoting of that data with the columns. So now if I want the column to be expanded, and I have expanded mine by location, that's why you saw each company in a separate column, I could have chosen something else. I could have chosen department or customer or vendor or item. So having the ability to use the dimensions at the transaction level to create the dimensionalized data then gives you dimensionalized data that you can use the reporting tools to filter based on those dimensions. It's very easy. It's part of your day-to-day activity. And, one of the things that you might be thinking is, okay, that's great. However, how am I going to make sure that when someone keys in a transaction, that it gets tagged to dimensions? So let's take a look at our general ledger for a moment. So one of the things that you'll do in your general ledger is define your chart. And that's what this is really all about. It's all about defining your chart of accounts, getting you to that modern chart that's going to allow you to really have a clean, easy to maintain chart, and at the same time give you the power to create and execute the types of reports that you need. So just to be clear, each one of our applications has one of these process maps. That's what you're looking at here. You might hear it referred to as an overview map. Great if you're a new user because it shows you pictorially many of the options that you can execute from this application. Always in this top swim lane, you're going to have your data elements. And one of those data elements here in General Ledger is, of course, the accounts. So this is your chart. This is your chart of accounts. And one of the other things that I would like to mention here too is, remember, I'm managing 4 companies in this one instance of Intact. Within a multi-entity environment, and by the way, I didn't say this, but let me mention it now, entity is the same thing as company. So if you were confused about the different terminology, I refer to it many times as company. Company equals entity. And an entity to Intact is typically something that has its own federal ID number. You can have unlimited companies, and you can have unlimited locations. So what you saw was Texas with Austin and Dallas. You can have unlimited locations rolling up to those entities or companies. Coming back to the chart, your chart of accounts today, if you're coming from a legacy system, may look very different, will look very different than this particular chart. One of the things that you can do in this multi-entity / company environment is you can share the chart of accounts. What a great piece of information that is, because that means that you only need to create one chart, not a chart for each one of your companies. We share the chart. We can also share customers and vendors, but sharing that chart means that you can eliminate many of the accounts in your chart that you're currently using. It also means that it's not a segmented chart of accounts. So there's 2 different kinds of charts. One is a linear chart, which is what you're using today in a legacy system, where you have the base account number and you have segments that represent additional information, like department, like project, like item, customer. The other type of chart is a table-driven chart, and that's what we use. We use a table-driven chart, which means that we don't require those segments. We're going to use the dimensions to get you that granular reporting. Now, back to the original comment of how do I make sure that the dimensions get entered on a transaction? When you set up an account, and I just opened up the account for my cash in bank, you'll notice that there is a section here, this is true on every single account, that says include dimensions. All you'll want to do is to populate or check the box next to the dimensions that are required for a specific account. When you have these activated and checked, that means that when a transaction is keyed, when you get ready to post it, it's going to come in and check to make sure that the rule is being met. And the rule here is anytime that you enter a transaction to cash and bank, you must have a department number. And if you don't, when you click on that post button, it's not going to post the transaction. You'll need to come back, you'll need to put in a department, and that will be a valid department because you will have a drop-down list that shows you your valid responses. That does a couple of things. One, it prevents you from being creative and putting in anything. So it is doing that validation. It also ensures that you're going to have comprehensive data, comprehensive dimensionalized data that you can then access with your reports. So here is where we're going to put in those dimension rules. And then when you create your chart, you'll only need to include the base account number. And remember that this chart can be shared across all of your companies. That means you only need to maintain one chart. If you add a new account number, you don't need to add it 4 or 5 different places. You add it here, and it works in all of your companies. So that's a little bit about the rules around those dimensions. In addition to that, let's come back to General Ledger here. And one of the things that people always want to know too is, what about these things called dimension structures? And I mentioned earlier that I used a dimension structure to set up some reports for purchasing. And I did this, several years ago because I had someone who was trying to do a lot of vendor analysis, and they were using our purchasing solution. They wanted to really understand what was being bought from whom, and then they also wanted to segregate those purchases that were what they called indirect. So what I did was I came in and I set up a structure called indirect suppliers. And this is a structure that's using the vendor dimension. And then what I did was I determined who the members were that fell into this indirect suppliers listing. So now I have certain vendors that are part of this structure, and when I go in to execute my report, I'm utilizing the indirect supplier vendor structure, that dimensional structure, to pull just these vendors for reporting purposes. So just to kind of give you an idea of, some of the advanced things that you might want to do with dimensions. Now, there's a couple of other things that I want to point out. As we talked about dimensions and we talked about reporting, for many of you coming from a different system, you may find that you need additional information to be tracked in Intact, and you may not see that information on a field. When you get ready to go through your implementation, that may come out when you're talking about the different reports that you create and you start thinking about how you're going to use dimensions. One of the things that we allow you to do is to create what we call custom fields. Not to be confused with dimensions. Dimensions are different than custom fields. A custom field here would allow me to add a field that is of various types. So it could be a date field, it could be a text field, it could be a drop-down pick list field. It can be a field that's required or not. So if you want to make sure that it gets populated, you could certainly make it required. And this is an example of some of the fields, the custom fields that I have added in my environment. Now, when you add those fields, you're going to tell me what kind of a field it is. So that's the data type. You're also going to tell me where does that field reside. So what object is it connected to? And, where do you want to see it? So in what area of the software do you want to see this particular field? So let's take a look at this in action. Makes a little bit more sense for you. When we look at accounts payable, we have the ability here, of course, to enter our AP bills. And as I enter an AP bill, I want you to kind of scroll down with me and notice that I have a custom field 1, a custom field 2, and some checkboxes. All 4 of these fields are custom fields. They're ones that I have added, and I have specifically said I want them to be on the AP bill header. So I'm determining where these show up on the form itself. So they might be on the header, they might be on the detail line. It might be in purchasing, as an example. I can have different kinds of purchase orders. It might be on the purchase order. It might be on the blanket purchase order. So I'm going to denote where I want these fields to be. And then the best news is any custom fields that you add are available with the custom report writer. So you will have access to the data. You'll be able to include these custom fields in any of the reports that you define in Intact. That's great news to you, because in addition to that, I would tell you that each object you can add 25 fields. with the exception of inventory. And inventory, you can add up to 100 fields. And all of that is available to you in the custom report writer. So just keeping that in mind, that these fields are different than dimensions. These fields are ones that, in my opinion, extend the data elements. So it extends the data that you're tracking, and more than likely it's data that you're currently tracking. So you want to make sure you have access to that here in Intact so that you can include that in any of your reports that you're defining. So let's come back to the controller dashboard for a moment. And as we wrap up today, let's just take another quick view of this income statement, and let's take a look at the filters. And while we're looking at these filters, let's talk about what we covered today. So one of the things that we learned was that Intact has the ability to use dimensions to filter and create those granular reports that you need. Those granular reports are really based on dimensionalized data. And to get to that dimensionalized data, you can tag your transactions, any transaction in Intact. We've seen two types of transactions today. We've seen transactions that were keyed from an AP invoice. We've also seen transactions from an AR sales invoice. We've drilled into those transactions. We've seen how those transaction lines could be tagged to one or more of the dimensions. When we look at our reports, we're then able to use that same dimension filtering like I just did for department and item to create different views of a report based on that dimensionalized data. We also saw on the dashboard the ability to use dimensions for filtering the dashboard. So now we've got dashboard filters based on dimensions as well. We also took a look at something called custom fields, and we just finished that up by looking at how we can add custom fields to extend the data that we are tracking in Intact. Custom fields are different than dimensions. Dimensions, we have up to 10 predefined and then unlimited user-defined dimensions. I want to thank you so much for your time and attention today,